Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's event on how states can and are taking on monopolies. I'm Stacy Mitchell, Co-Executive Director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And we are thrilled to co-host this event with the State Innovation Exchange. We have a great lineup of speakers. Many of the challenges people face in their lives today are directly related to unchecked concentration of corporate power. Whether it's rapidly rising rents, sky-high grocery prices, struggling rural communities, pharmacy deserts, grocery deserts, coercion and abuse on the job, all of these things are connected to the concentration of corporate power. Over the past few years, we've seen a major push by policymakers to dust off our antitrust laws and put them to use as they were intended, to safeguard Americans against outsized corporate power. While much of the spotlight has been on federal enforcement, a lot of energy and action has been happening at the state level, and that's what today's event is all about, exploring what states are doing and can do to tackle this issue. Before we start, a brief overview of the program and a few housekeeping notes. We'll kick off today's event with a fireside chat with two Attorneys General, Kris Mayes and Keith Ellison. This will be followed by a panel discussion of state lawmakers and advocates facilitated by my colleague, Ron Knox. We'll be taking questions from the audience, so please submit any questions for the speakers in the Q&A function at any point during the event. And with that, it is my great honor to introduce Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison and Arizona Attorney General Kris Mayes. AG Ellison has served as Minnesota's Attorney General since 2019. He was the lead prosecutor in the matter of the 2020 death of George Floyd in Minneapolis and led the team successfully convicting former police officer Derek Chauvin. As the people's lawyer, Attorney General Ellison's job is to help Minnesotans afford their lives and live with dignity, safety, and respect. His office has enforced executive orders barring evictions and price gouging, and successfully defended the constitutionality of pandemic-related executive orders in court. AG Kris Mayes is Arizona's 27th Attorney General, becoming the first mom and second woman ever to be elected to this office. She's one of Arizona's strongest consumer advocates. She served the Napolitano administration and won 2 statewide elections to serve as commissioner for the Arizona Corporation Commission. Under her leadership, the commission helped create tens of thousands of high-paying jobs, save consumers billions of dollars, and required utilities to produce more clean and efficient energy. Welcome to you both, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to start with a question actually for both of you, but I'll ask you, AG Ellison, to respond first. You know, there's been a lot of focus on the federal government enforcing our antitrust laws and reining in abuses. And I think, you know, a lot of people can think of states as really kind of secondary on these issues, but that's not the case. And I'm wondering, AG Ellison, if you can give us a little bit of orientation to the role of states in antitrust.
Yeah, the states have a critical role to play here, and I would advise anybody who's worried about fair competition, the shrinking presence of small business in rural communities, anybody who's concerned about, one company towns where they can just tell people what they're going to pay them and then take it or leave it, needs to think about how they can engage their attorney general's office at the state level. I'll give you an example, what I mean. Just recently, the state of Illinois and state of Minnesota joined with the FTC to take on John Deere because of their unfair rules regarding right to repair. If you are a farmer in Minnesota, you need to be able to keep that combine working. And if they share the codes with you, you could probably fix it yourself or get somebody close by. But if you don't, you might have to wait a week or two in the middle of growing season until John Deere decides you're going to get somebody out there to fix your combine, and that can ruin you. And so we've got to have the kind of change. A lot of times these problems are very local. They need to be dealt with on a local basis. And I'll just give one quick example before I hand it to Kris. And that is, we had some hospital consolidation that we were concerned about. We were very worried if this particular out-of-state hospital combined with our hospital, then in our hospital was connected to the University of Minnesota, then we could basically be controlled by an out-of-state entity that didn't have the best record in terms of workers' rights, providing for a woman's right to choose because the out-of-state hospital happened to be in the hands of a very conservative South Dakotan. And so, there were a lot of reasons why this merger was worrisome. State legislators got together, passed a law, gave us some authority to evaluate every transaction from the standpoint of whether it's in the best interest of the state of Minnesota and Minnesotans. And so that there again, that merger did not go through, but other mergers have. It's not like we want to stop all mergers. Some mergers are a good idea, but we got to have the power to stop the bad ones. So states are a big player. States work with the Fed sometimes, and states work together, all to protect people in our local communities.
And AG Mayes, let me send that same question to you, and I wondering if you could also speak. I mean, coming out of a background in regulating utilities and sort of coming into the role of AG, a lot of things that AGs do, but you've really chosen to prioritize antitrust, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, and then also just as a point of orientation for people, people know that we have federal antitrust laws. Do state AGs enforce the federal laws? Are there also state laws? Can you just help set the stage for people on that front?
Sure. Yeah, Stacey, thanks. And thanks for having AG Ellison and I with you. This is really appreciate ILSR and the State Innovation Exchange for having this incredibly important conversation and for really lifting up antitrust law and the need to protect Americans from the overreach of corporations. And I think Keith did an amazing job. He's such a leader, and I was just taking notes because I love the work that he does. And I think your question was a great one, which is we hear obviously a lot about what the FTC is doing at the federal level, and under Lena Khan, it has been amazing. And I am so sad to see her go. And we're going to talk about this later. Obviously, we want to see the new administration to continue the federal focus on antitrust. But as you just heard from Keith, and I'll talk about a little bit about it at the state level, the states are absolutely in a position to enforce antitrust laws. Yes, we do have state most of us, I think, have state antitrust laws. Certainly we do have that here in Arizona. We have the Arizona Uniform Antitrust Act. We also have the Arizona Consumer Fraud Act, which we can use in tandem with the antitrust law that we have here. And then we always can join with the FTC, which has happened many times, several times already in my 2 years in office here in Arizona. Again, like Keith, I'll give you a couple of Arizona-based examples. We joined with the FTC to sue to stop the Kroger-Albertsons merger, the proposed Kroger-Albertsons merger. And that included not just the FTC, but also 8 states joined that action with the FTC. And then 2 of our states, Washington and Colorado, filed their own separate state actions. We chose to join the FTC. We also had that extra added layer of having Washington's AG, Bob Ferguson, and Colorado's AG, Phil Weiser, do their own state actions. We won that lawsuit. We stopped that merger. And, I spent the better part of all of last year traveling throughout Arizona, talking about that merger with Arizonans. And these are very bipartisan issues. And I think the one Keith brought up with John Deere is another great example of that. I'm pretty sure Keith found that just as many Republicans as Democrats were worried about the impact of that, right? So that's also important. These are issues that are impacting, everybody, regardless of their political stripes. And that's why we're being so aggressive about it. But so the short answer is the states have an incredibly important role to play. And that role will probably only grow if the federal government retreats. I hope that they don't, but we shall see.
Thank you for that. It was really wonderful to see the Kroger-Albertsons merger blocked by both in one of the state cases and the federal and combined state case. Really encouraging. And I think you look at those rulings and you see the judges are really waking up in a way that they haven't been to what these problems are. So really extraordinary. AG Ellison, if I could go back to you, I want to circle back. You mentioned the hospital merger bill that passed through the legislature, giving some more oversight and enforcement around proposed hospital mergers to your office. I'm wondering, there as I've looked across at state antitrust laws, we've noticed that it's sort of uneven. Some states have really strong laws, some states have strong laws, but they have gaps with certain kinds of issues. And I'm wondering if you have any insights, like how was their momentum built around that bill? How can we encourage state lawmakers to get involved in filling some of those gaps and strengthening these laws?
Well, thanks for that question. Kris and I agree. We've just got to talk about it more. And I think antitrust really has the answer to a lot of the economic questions that are bothering people. People want to know, why are our wages stagnant? Why do we have a disappearing pharmacies around our state? Why are grocery prices going up? Why are rental prices going up? Why are all these economic challenges happening? And I think there's one overwhelming, overriding answer. This is a consolidation of markets. If you want to talk about why are your drugs high, expensive, consolidation. Why is your rental apartment up? Well, RealPage is part of the problem. What about your groceries? Let's talk about agri-stats. Talk about, telecom, all kinds of things. All goes back to the fact that in 1980, we just stopped doing antitrust. We kind of stopped doing it. We were sold a bill of goods. We were told that economies of scale, which you could achieve with really big enterprises, were going to mean lower prices for consumers. And what we ended up learning is that they used their size just to clear out the market with predatory pricing and then jack everybody up. And so we were promised something with this thing, consumer welfare. We abandoned the model of the Brandeis analysis, where we look at all of the players in the market and how this merger is going to affect everyone, and we opted for this other thing. People may remember, if you're old enough to remember, how Robert Bork got challenged in the Senate confirmation hearing. It revolved a lot around the issue of a right to choose. But that's only one thing that he was doing that people need to be concerned about. Actually, was his thinking around antitrust. He probably is the father of the new way to evaluate merger cases and acquisitions that has gone to the disadvantage of most players in our economy, except for the monopolists themselves. So that's kind of the emergence of this. And so now, as policymakers are trying to come up with reasons and explanations as to why the economy is not working very well, what we find is that a generation before Bork, we did have more answers than we have now. We had the Robinson-Pacman Act. We had the Stockyard Act and the Meatpackers Act. We had the FTC Act. We had tools that were on the books, some state, some federal, but now it's time to get back into it again. Now, if we aspire, and we all do, to help people afford their lives and have an opportunity at meaningful prosperity and retirement, we've got to take on these markets. We've got to take on competition. And that means good news for the small business person, good news for the innovators, good news for the workers, good news for the consumers. Maybe not such good news for the monopolists, but they're not doing that much good for us anyway. And so that's really kind of how it goes. I think these things are driven by necessity, and you holding this forum today with Kris and I is going to do a lot of good, because there's some people listening to this conversation and are going to think what we thought in Minnesota. Hey, we need to update our law. I'll just shut up after I say this. One of the big problems with antitrust law is that it's very expensive and it is expert heavy. It doesn't have to be. It's just the way that the big dogs have structured the jurisprudence in this area. So they can just like they can raise barriers to entry in meat, they can raise barriers to entry when it comes to lawsuits to hold them accountable, and they have done so. And now what we need is to really sort of rewrite the rules to make them have to prove that their merger is not going to hurt competition. Not that we have this massive burden to prove that it is, but we need every policymaker involved in this conversation. Last word on this, there's a woman named Zephyr Teachout. She was written a lot on this. She's a professor out there in New York, and she can explain how 100 years ago, like in 1925, there were anti-monopoly committees all over the United States. They understood that massive corporate power meant weakness for you, the farmer, the citizen, and they also infected our democracy because they got a hold of these legislators and rewrote the rules in their favor. So I'll stop right there.
I love that you shared that about the monopoly committees. That's really incredible. It's been encouraging to see. I mean, the word monopoly used to be part of, people's everyday language about politics. Seeing state lawmakers in Minnesota and elsewhere beginning to get involved in this issue and push, as you said, this legislation through, and really talk about the consequences in practical terms has been really encouraging. AG Mayes, you've really been particularly focused on you've on sort of what this means for the pocketbooks of Arizona residents. Last year, you sued a company called RealPage, as I understand it, for allegedly conspiring to raise rents for hundreds of thousands of renters in Phoenix and Tucson. I mean, that is a very practical pocketbook issue. Can you just talk a little bit about who is RealPage and what is this case about?
Yeah, so we brought this lawsuit against a software company called RealPage, and 9 major landlords that do business in Arizona, but really they're all across America. The AG of the District of Columbia, Brian Schwab, also brought that lawsuit, and now multiple AGs have brought a similar lawsuit with the Department of Justice, including you, Keith. Okay, so Minnesota as well, and this is really important, and this has had a huge impact. These companies and this alleged conspiracy, this conspiracy that we have alleged, is impacting Arizonans tremendously and in terrible ways. And we allege that RealPage colluded with these landlords and got them to provide proprietary competitive data to RealPage, and they inputted information like locations of apartment units, what the units were renting for, what the units looked like, square footage, all the kinds of things you would not normally give to your competitors if you were really in a competitive marketplace, right? But they gave it to RealPage. RealPage used their algorithm, so it's algorithmic price fixing, essentially, and they spat out a price that then all of the landlords agreed, aka colluded, to utilize. And in Phoenix, this was widespread. I mean, 70% of the rental market in Phoenix is controlled by this conspiracy, is affected by this conspiracy. 70% of the renters in Phoenix have been harmed by this conspiracy, by this price fixing through an algorithm. More than 50% of the apartment units in Tucson were affected, have been and are being affected by this price fixing scheme. And I'll tell you what, nothing that I have done as Attorney General of Arizona has had this much, has resonated this much with Arizonans. Everywhere I go, people bring this lawsuit up to me and say, thank you, Kris, for bringing this. I thought something was going on. I couldn't understand why my rent kept going up and up and up. And Keith probably is hearing the same thing. In Phoenix, rent has gone up since 2016 by 36%, and that's probably a conservative number. And so I think a huge part of that is this conspiracy. We don't have a competitive rental market in Arizona anymore, at least not in our major urban areas. It used to be if you were a landlord, you would compete against the landlord next to you by doing what? Lowering price, right? Now the landlords who are part of this conspiracy with RealPage, they don't care about lowering price. All they care about is increasing price. They don't care about the fact that their units might be empty, sitting empty, as long as they can keep raising rents on the people who are living in those apartment complexes. They're good. They call it a day. Everything's good for them. And so we sued them under Arizona's antitrust laws and under our Consumer Fraud Act, alleging that they engaged in deceptive practices. And I just think it's a really, really important case for average Arizonans who are suffering under high prices, under inflation, and in this case, it's just flat out fraud and a violation of our antitrust laws.
Wow, I mean, that's shocking. 70% of renters in Phoenix and, rents going up by those huge increases. I mean, just really amazing. I heard just a sort of quick follow-up on that. I heard from a friend of a friend who was doing some door knocking for some campaign in Arizona who said that voters were volunteering when just sort of asked a generic question about what are you concerned about? They were volunteering that they were deeply concerned about the Kroger-Albertsons merger. This was before the court ruled against it. And I thought that was pretty extraordinary. And I know you held some town halls, and obviously you've been outspoken on taking action on the RealPage landlord issue. I don't know if you have any sort of words of advice or lessons learned, for other state AGs who are moving to be more aggressive on antitrust about how you engage with voters and bring them into this.
Yeah, I just keep doing these cases because they are so important, and they are important to voters across the political spectrum, and they impact voters and people across the political spectrum. And yeah, we did those. I think I did 8 or 9 town halls on Kroger Albertsons. Seniors were worried about the potential to lose access to pharmacies. They were worried about price increases. People were worried about job losses. A lot of these grocery stores are the economic engines of small towns throughout Arizona. I assume the same in Minnesota.
Certainly.
And people were worried, about food deserts being exacerbated, especially in rural Arizona. The impact, I think, of that merger would have been enormous across Arizona, but especially in rural Arizona. And I think we all have to pay attention to the rural parts of our state that feel like and I know Keith talks about this all the time, but do feel like they've been left behind. And so one of the things that we as AGs can do for the rural parts of our state is to make sure that corporations are held accountable for doing the right thing, not violating our antitrust laws, and not engaging in the kind of price fixing, for instance, that RealPage engaged in. But that merger certainly would have had a huge impact. And as I said, the people have reacted really strongly in favor of what we've done out here in Arizona on RealPage and the Kroger-Albertsons merger.
That's fantastic.
Bravo.
And AG Ellison, let me go to you with my last question of our chat today. We are seeing these big tech CEOs, big tech companies making donations to Trump's inauguration, big donations. We're seeing them fly down to Mar-a-Lago to have dinner with him. We're seeing him change his tune sometimes and talking about Meta and Google and so on after those dinners. We're seeing Amazon buy
immigration laws,
Right. That's absolutely right. So anyway, what I'm getting to with this is, I think I'm hearing a lot of nervousness on people's parts about what's going to happen with federal antitrust enforcement under this administration. Even as much, bipartisan support as both of you have sort of referenced among voters, it's not clear that this is an administration that's going to really take these issues on, and we may actually see the opposite. And so, do you have any, can we feel what happens if federal enforcers say, for example, decide to settle the Amazon monopolization case for, pennies on the dollar, like let them off the hook completely with a settlement that's not really a settlement. Like, can states that are on that case, can they carry it forward? Like, what happens? What is, how can states sort of keep this going?
Well, I can only speak for the state where the folks voted for me, but I believe that me and my colleagues, and we're committed to this in the long term. That's many folks file their own case, filed it knowing that the feds might not be a reliable partner. And so, look, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I mean, when the feds join you in a case, it does help. But one monkey doesn't stop the circus, and we're not going to quit, because no matter what the federal government does, we're going to keep on going. Whether it has to do with Ticketmaster, RealPage, AgriStats, which operate. I love the way you explained how RealPage works, Kris, because the AgriStats works very similar, but it has to do with like broiler chicken and things like that. But let me just say this, because your question really is raising a very important question here. When we think of monopoly, antitrust, oligopoly, monopsony, that's all that's economic stuff. But the danger of their market concentration is they take the excessive profits and they buy members of Congress and they buy administrations and they capture state agencies. Our politics are damaged. And the one thing that the average person working in a diner in Phoenix or Minneapolis can say is that I have a vote, and I'm going to vote for those folks who are going to look out for my economic welfare. Well, they're trying to buy the democracy as well. So it doesn't just stop at them using their money to buy consumer items. They try to purchase our politics as well. And that's another reason why we've got to keep on doing these forums, and why I'm so grateful to you guys keep holding this forum today. And as always, I just want to thank Kris for being such an amazing leader, and she's an inspiration, and we try to hold each other up.
Well, you both are the kinds of cops I love to have on the beat. I want to thank you both for your just incredibly inspiring comments and leadership, and for making time to join us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we are...
See you, Kris.
Bye, Keith. Thank you.
Now we're going to move on to the panel discussion, and I want to pass things off to my colleague Ron Knox, who's ILSR's senior researcher and policy advocate, to introduce the next panel. Over to you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Stacy. What an incredible conversation that was. As Stacy said, I'm Ron Knox, Senior Researcher Policy Advocate with ILSR's Independent Business Team. That was a fantastic and, for me, really an energizing conversation that we just had with two of our country's most prominent trust-busting attorneys general about how state enforcers can use laws on the books to help create a kind of economic fairness within their borders. That's a fairness for shoppers, a fairness for workers, and indeed a fairness for small and independent businesses, and also how lawmakers can help support those efforts. Here in just a moment, I'm going to introduce our next panelists, who will talk about what those abuses of corporate power really look like in the economy today, and the role that state lawmakers can play, and increasingly are playing, in creating the tools needed to promote a fair and competitive economy. But before we kick off, I wanted to very quickly reiterate some of the real level-setting fundamentals that Stacy and the attorneys general touched on a bit earlier. The first thing that I think is key when considering states' roles in fighting monopoly and promoting fairness is indeed their constitutional place in this fight. Our federalist system of government gives power and authority to state lawmakers and enforcers, and emboldens them to foster fair and open markets within their borders. This isn't just some side quest for states. This isn't something that states have to do begrudgingly when the feds fall down on the job. This is fundamentally part of state officials' role and their duty, and one that they are relied upon to do well and often by consumers, businesses, and working families who reside there. It's crucial work that delivers real benefits to residents, whether they're in a big city, small towns, or anywhere in between. The second thing to keep in mind during this conversation is that this is work that's already happening in many places around the country. States are increasingly embracing a critical role that they play in building a fair economy. As we've heard, attorneys general are fighting dangerous hospital and supermarket mergers. They're taking on Amazon's monopoly power. They're giving consumers the power to fix their own electronics. This is really basic quality of life improvements. We now have new, stronger antitrust laws in places like Washington, Colorado, California, and beyond. In Ohio, the state has sued prescription drug middlemen for ripping off patients in independent pharmacies. This is a long list and it's growing, but the struggle to free communities from the harms of corporate power has miles to go, and now is the time for states across the country to play their part. Okay, that's the table setting. Let's talk. Let's talk about what's happening, and let's talk about what needs to happen. And to do that, we have an outstanding panel. We're very, very happy to have them all here with us. I'm going to introduce them now. Our first panelist is Ida Eskamani. Ida is the Senior Director for Legislative Affairs with State Innovation Exchange, our wonderful partners in this event, where she supports legislative champions to take on corporate interests and build people-centered state governments. Next, we have Tammy Hetrick, who is the president and CEO of the Washington Food Industry Association, which represents independent grocers, convenience stores, and their suppliers in the great state of Washington. Last but certainly not least, we have Representative J.D. Schulten, who represents the 1st District in the Iowa State House. And before he was in the State House, he ran for Congress, where he became a champion for rural communities and an ardent critic of concentrated corporate power. Along with being a lawmaker, he is also a professional baseball pitcher, one of some notoriety, I'll say, for the hometown Sioux City Explorers. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention he's also co-author of the terrific Substack, You're Probably Getting Screwed, which explores the way monopoly power harms people and communities. Thank you all so very much for being here. It is a pleasure to have you. I'm going to get right into the questions. Ida, the first one is for you. From your vantage point, from where you sit in the world, you have a view of important work happening around corporate power in states around the country. Fights that are happening, fights that are materializing, resistance that is materializing to these abuses of corporate power. From that vantage point, what opportunities do you see for state-based advocates and organizers to move the dial to rein in monopoly power? Simpler way to put that, where are the fights happening? Where should the corporate power fights be happening? And where can we win?
Thank you, Ron, and thank you, everyone. What an honor to collaborate with y'all at this briefing. And I'm also so fired up by the Attorney General's talk. And it's great to be here with so many esteemed panelists. And we at the State Innovation Exchange are so grateful to co-host this briefing with y'all. And just a little point of personal privilege, this is my work. I'm also the daughter of working class immigrants from Iran. I grew up in the Kmart my mom worked at for 15 years until the Super Walmart opened up with local incentives and shuttered the doors of that Kmart and those jobs. And so this work it's really personal, and that's the story that we all see across the country in our communities. And so for folks who are not yet familiar with SIX, our work spans all 50 states. And to your question, Ron, where the fight should happen, that is where it should happen, in the states, in our local communities, in our neighborhoods. And when you talk about opportunities on this front, anti-monopoly campaigns, which of course run the gambit, right? We talked about antitrust. They also are banning non-compete agreements, banning junk fees, right to repair, tackling private equity, AI, surveillance, housing, tenant rights, public options, protecting our local independent businesses, workers' rights to organize. These are issues that fall under that anti-monopoly umbrella that offer an opportunity to unite causes and communities. And I think that opportunity is really important. When you fight corporate monopolies, you have an opportunity to center justice, right? Center racial, gender, economic justice, because the communities in this country most impacted by concentrated corporate power are those who sit at the intersections of structural disparities, right? Most exploited by corporate monopolies. But you are able to center justice while also building a multiracial class solidarity among race, gender, immigration status, various political ideologies. This issue brings folks together, rural and urban communities, and again, workers, local businesses, and consumers united on a common cause with clearly identified villains, which we can all you feel every day. You see them, you deal with them. It's the most real fight you can have, right? It's not one you have to teach and explain to people. I think there was a good point made earlier that sometimes antitrust can be very wonky. It doesn't have to be, because it's not. Everybody deals with it every day in your life, right? And that's something we constantly see with our legislators and our organizing partners and what we hear directly from constituents, right? And so to your question around where there's momentum, and to your point, this is not a new fight. I mean, the history of tackling corporate monopolies started at the local and state level. It's the local and state work that brings the federal momentum, right? And so in this moment, it really is up to us to lead at the state and local level. And so with our state legislators, we see momentum across the country, to your point, in Minnesota attacking healthcare mergers, from, of course, Arizona, and that we just heard from Ohio, Alaska, Iowa, Tennessee, New York State, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and my home state of Florida. We're seeing organizing across the country tackling a lot of those issues I just talked about, from antitrust to junk fees and non-competes to housing consolidation. The list goes on and on. And so really across the country, we're seeing state legislators working in collaboration with constituents, workers, local businesses, consumers, really taking on some of the largest corporations, not just in America, but in the world, to deliver real tangible gains for working families. And so that is, it's a lot, but we're seeing it everywhere.
No, it's incredible. And it's just rejuvenating, really inspiring to hear about that momentum in the States and to see it manifest. I want to drill down a little bit into something you mentioned, Ida, and that's the way that these harms really kind of, can appear in communities and for workers, for small businesses. I'm going to hand the mic over to Tammy. Tammy, from your position at the Washington Food Industry Association, you obviously hear from your members about what they're experiencing in the market. From what you hear, how does that monopoly power impact independent grocers, the independent grocers that you represent? How does that corporate power that we're talking about affect their lives and their ability to run their businesses?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ron. I'm just honored to be part of this panel. What a dynamic group. So I want to just set a background quickly. Washington State, we're somewhat unique. I'm one of the few associations that only represent independent grocers. We don't manage any publicly traded. We do not represent them. So we were a key support for our Attorney General during that Kroger merger, because we were able to, meet with our members and really be part of that and be active in it. But the one thing that's really important to know about independent grocers is in Washington State, they have a 1% profit margin just so they can remain competitive. It's very challenging for them to compete with those larger stores. And so, we have so many examples that we can share, but I'll just share a few of those that really came to light during the pandemic. That's when it just became blatantly clear where there was just this real defined separatism. One of the things that we saw was our small and medium distribution providers were told specifically that grocery class trade was removed from access to products like ball and care canning supplies, which for our rural communities is huge, and we had pictures from our rural stores with just empty shelves, and they were panicking. And then you'd go to a local publicly traded store and their shelves are full, and so it was very frustrating to see that we were told they can't have those supplies because they're only going to sell them to large distribution mass class. Same thing happened with Coleman propane canisters. The 16-ounce propane canisters was stopped to grocers and only to mass class and outdoor retailers. So they really just took us out of the equation. And in those, again, some of those communities were the only store. So that was a challenge. One of the biggest ones that I think a lot of consumers struggled with was pet food. And that was really a problem for us because again, stores just couldn't even get pet food. And yet they'd go to a bigger store and here's, shelves with every kind of pet food you could want. So we saw that. And I think now one of the things that we're struggling with is eggs. With the avian flu and everything that's going on around us, we're again treated like second-class citizens for access and availability. So there's an issue of pricing and how we're treated for pricing because we can't do those mass quantities, so to speak. But it's also an issue of just supply and being able to have access to supply. Even a fair distribution. We were never provided with details of how they were determining what a fair distribution of supply was during COVID. So those are just a few, examples. We do have a very robust antitrust division in Washington State, and the team is amazing. I can't tout them enough. I work with them quite regularly, and we really are trying to take that next step and start looking into some of these other challenges that independent grocers and convenience stores have with trying to compete with those nationally traded groups.
Yeah,
So,
I was gonna. I mean, the things that it sounds like you're describing. This all sounds like discrimination, right? This sounds like a big corporate power, literally having the influence necessary to discriminate against small businesses, and that has all kinds of effects for the folks who rely on those small grocers to access, food, basic necessities. Real quickly, what would you like to see state lawmakers do to help move that fight along, to give you new tools that you might need to to end those practices?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And, we're really asking them to look at the Robinson-Patman and how they can work within that and kind of help us and support us in that. The one thing that did really come to light, and what we've heard from manufacturers and others, is there's a side of bullying that the large companies do. And when we were involved in the Kroger merger and my independent grocers were included in that, we saw how that affected us. We were bullied in that, by the attorneys who were managing that case. So our AGs have really kind of stepped up and helped us in that, but we're ready to take the next step. And I've met with them. And so hopefully we can really start pushing Robinson-Patman at a state level and engage.
That's excellent. Thank you, Tammy. Yeah, I mean, I think that the issues that you're describing it's not just unique to the grocery sector, right? It's all across the retail economy, and I think Robinson-Patman is definitely an important tool in that toolbox. JD, I would like to ask you a little bit about where you are from and the folks you represent. Northwest Iowa is not the most urban place in the world, and I know that you represent and you've advocated on behalf of folks who live in cities, folks who live in small towns, rural areas. Can you speak to the ways that reining in corporate power using antitrust really resonates with the communities that you're from, the folks that you represent and you advocate for?
Yes. So when I decided to run for Congress in 2018 and then again in 2020, one of the best things I had was that nobody thought I had a chance. So I was able to do whatever I want. And so I ended up hosting town halls and just go town to town and really created this grassroots campaign. And I talked to voters who would always vote for me and ones who will never vote for me and everywhere in between. And almost every time I would bring up corporate greed or antitrust, and I didn't get pushback one single time. And so when you look about the history, and this is in the second most agriculture producing district in the country, and when you look at the history of the antitrust, it was farmers standing up to railroads. And I believe Iowa had the first antitrust law in the state or in the United States. But then when the pandemic happened, we saw the spotlight on this. We saw workers or farmers being squeezed both on the input side and the market side. We saw workers being suppressed, and we saw consumers paying the most they ever have for meat. All the while, these huge multinational corporations were making record profits. And so it was an easy sell when it comes to that. Now, these voters may not understand the Sherman Act or Robinson-Patman Act or the Packers and Stockyards Act, but they understand and felt what was going on. And so, and when you think about Iowa, you think about agriculture. Yet we have food deserts all across the state. We have grocers going out, local groceries going out of business, and a lot of people's closest grocery store, quote unquote grocery store, is Dollar General that's 20 miles away. And then 90% of the food Iowans eat is imported. So when you add all that up, like that's why I'm passionate about creating a regional food system, one that allows food to stay more local, money to stay more local, and just eat healthier. And so that's one of the many things that I do. I'm ranking member on agriculture now, and I try to push for some of those things. And so I'm also, so Sioux City is an immigrant meatpacking town. I love where I'm from, but it can be pretty challenging because I'm the only Democrat in 41 counties in Northwest Iowa. So I say I'm a blueberry in a bowl of tomato soup. So with the Republicans controlling the trifecta down at the Capitol, I don't get to pass the bills that I want to pass, like what the two attorney generals, what they get to work on and things like that. But at that same point, I'm able to use my platform. So you mentioned the Substack that you're probably getting screwed. I appreciate that. So I able to use my voice through that, and also events like we were able to host an event hosted with Six. So thank you, Ida, and the Farmers Union that brought Lena Khan in to talk to Iowa farmers about a potential fertilizer merger. And so it's things like that even though I may not be able to get the bills I want to pass now, it's building that coalition for something down the road, and then looking to our neighbors up the north or other places, the north has in Minnesota, or other places that can actually pass some of the bills you're passionate about. And I'll end with the best advice I got when I first started to run, and nobody thought I had a chance. A gentleman named Frank Lemaire, who's a Native American activist, and he knew it was going to be a challenge. And he goes, JD, if you want change, you have to get uncomfortable. And once you get uncomfortable, you have to get others uncomfortable. So in this antitrust movement, more and more people are feeling that uncomfortable, and it's up to us to channel that into something bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the things that I'm hearing you talk about, the things that I'm hearing is that, like, it doesn't matter the political makeup of a place, the place where you're at, the place where you represent. These are issues that can push through those partisan divides, and that really speak to the material reality of the way that people live their lives at home, and the ways that they tend to struggle under the thumb of corporate power. I appreciate that. Let me ask you one more thing, JD. We live in a time where a lot of, I think, the political conversation in America is really driven by identity politics. Things that are intended to be wedges. They're intended to divide us, even though, talking about those issues never seem to really too much to actually improve the lives of folks. What role can lawmakers play in refocusing our discussion to these kinds of really core kitchen table issues of economic fairness, of equity, that can really help folks do better and help them in their lives?
Well, I think so much of this, we get this or that. So it's Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative. I view that more and more of what politics is right now in this moment is not so much left versus right, it's up versus down. And the guy who sits next to me for the past few years, and we just started our legislative session this week, who still sits next to me, is as far as the opposite end of the spectrum. But one of my most proud moments was last year. I railed on a bill and complained about it and sat down, and I didn't notice, but he had his light on. And so he spoke right after me, and he stood up there and he goes, "I'm sick of the corporate lobbyists lined up in this back hall." And it was against his own speaker. And I just slow clapped because there is more commonality than what people think when it comes to this issue, because people are feeling this. And you just see the income inequality that doesn't get brought up enough in mainstream media or anything like that, but it's there and people feel it. And I think the movement, I mean, what we've seen compared to like when I first ran in 2018, hardly anybody was talking about this. And now we're seeing more and more this anti-monopoly movement, and that's what gives me hope.
Yeah, that's great. It gives me hope as well. Last question is for Ida, and then I want to get to questions from our audience, which we have many, I'm told. So that's very exciting. So Ida, last question for you. Look, there are lots of important, like legitimate issues on the minds of folks today, reproductive rights, immigration, and so on. With all of that on people's minds, with all of those issues being real and tangible, what is the appetite that you see out there in your work, for taking on corporate power and for working on those kind of kitchen table economic issues?
What a great question. I do want to give a shout out to Representative Schulten, who's a member of our cohort for rural opportunity and prosperity, our cross-state cohort of legislators who represent rural communities, and he's such a rock star in our network. And so we're so grateful to share this panel with him and so much of our work. But to your question, Ron, it's really important. I think what we find is when you follow the money behind the assaults on workers, on local businesses, on disenfranchised communities, you will find it's the same concentrated corporate power. It is the same group of billionaires and corporations working to concentrate and consolidate their power. And the different assaults we see on these different communities are also just about access to education, healthcare, and jobs. And so no matter what you look like, who you love, where you're from, we all want those same things. And so when we talk about the appetite for these kitchen table issues, everyone has it. When you talk to anyone, that is exactly what they care about. And these different very well-resourced assaults on folks are really about those same things: access to the economy and the power you have in your democracy. And then when you follow the money even further around the assaults on local democracy, on our freedom to vote, on our court system, you will find, again, the same monopolists, billionaires and corporations working to concentrate control. And so really, when it comes to like what the fight is, we're fighting one big fight. And it's about what kind of country do we have? Is it one that we all have power, or is it one where power is in the hands of the very elite few? And I believe in the model we all have power. And I think that's why we're all here together taking on corporate monopolies. And so I always want to remind folks that like these fights are the same, and it's all about building that solidarity across communities and not getting distracted by the divide and conquer tactics. And anti-monopoly fights really help us to like unify around a shared vision and a shared villain. And so they're just not only the moral imperative and like the right thing to do and the thing that can really deliver for working families and our local businesses, it's also strategically an excellent campaign to choose as an organizer because it brings a lot of different folks together.
I agree completely. And I talk about this all the time. I really do. I'll bang the drum about this forever, but workers, small businesses, they don't always seem like they're in the same bucket, but we're all living under the thumb of concentrated corporate power and monopoly power, and one struggle is the other struggle as well. Thank you for that, Ida. I appreciate that. Okay, we have like a million questions from our audience, which is exciting, and I'm happy that people are engaged. They're really locked into this. So I'm going to get right into it. Here, I'm going to start off with this question because I think it's a good one, and it's kind of what we've been talking about. What can those, and this is from Renee. Renee, thank you. What can those of us in states that currently do not have strong antitrust movements, they're in Virginia, do to build that movement from the ground up? Should we support, recruit elected officials who support trust busting, build lobbying efforts with grassroots outreach, work within our parties? What should be our priority if we have to choose? I want you to take a stab at this first, and then I want JD to weigh in. But what are your thoughts?
It's a great question, and it's an important one. I think I do reflect a little bit on what Representative Schulten said around the long-term work. So what you do now might not feel like it's making the headways, but the work we do now in these real hostile states like my state of Florida, where our Attorney General is doing everything corporations want, is around that long-term work to build a better future. And you got to start somewhere, right? And so just dig in the areas that you're passionate about. I think the other piece is that education. A lot of folks you will find are actually fighting monopoly fights, but don't realize they're fighting monopoly fights, right? So you might have a really great housing coalition. You might really have a really great energy coalition. You might have a really great, small business arm. And like folks are doing the work, but not seeing it as like, oh, concentrated corporate power. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. So there's also a sense of just like that stakeholder analysis and then like having those one-on-ones with folks. And then folks really start to realize like, oh, actually, I am an anti-monopolist. Like I just didn't know I was fighting corporate monopolies. And so I think that is that kind of analysis piece. Also very happy to talk offline to dive deeper too, to help strategize. But those are some quick thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, I have a good quick example. So it just came out this week that in my hometown, Sioux City, we have a Cargill plant, and it was fined $10,000 for having, I believe it was either 12 or 17 times the amount of emissions that were toxic than what they're allowed. And for that amount, that's Right Heart in Sioux City, and only a $10,000 fine on a company that makes billions and billions of dollars. So what we're doing as a group, we're going to have, not this weekend, but next weekend, we are going to have a event in Sioux City to talk about that. And to talk about that is corporate power hurting all of us, and just trying to build that bridge, because it happens all around us all the time. So that's just an example of something that you can do.
I think it's a great example. I think it's fantastic. And I think that for folks who are out there looking for ways to push back on corporate power, I think, find those examples, look local. And there are good fights to have out there, even if you're in a state that isn't, that doesn't have an attorney general, maybe who's focused on these issues. Okay, thank you both. Second question, and this is one that I think everybody can really relate to, but this one's for Tammy. I want Tammy to kick this one off. And this is from Kris. Thank you, Kris. What can be done about the predatory dollar discount stores ruining small towns, ruining small business in their downtowns? Tammy, I'm assuming your membership deals with the power of dollar stores all the time. What advice do you have for folks out there trying to push back?
We really do. This is a great question and something we're really working on. And what I've been talking to my grocers about is really focus on the things they don't have. Bottom line, we cannot compete for the same dollar. We don't have the buying power. We're not going to be there. But what we do is we have a strong community message. And so if people in that community understand how important their grocer is to them, and keeping that going and not focus on going to that dollar store every time you need something, that's really critical. So it's the relationship that really helps us. But, until we can get fair buying power and we don't have these, predatory purchasing powers, we're just going to have to do everything we can. So that's a great question. And again, it's just being strong in your community.
Yeah, absolutely. I want JD to weigh in as well. But I'm going to take, what do they call it? Moderator privilege or whatever. I'm going to step in real quickly because I want to say we've been talking, we mentioned a few times, a few different people have mentioned the Robinson-Patman Act. And I want to make kind of clear, because what does that mean to anybody on the call? Who knows? Okay. So what the Robinson-Patman Act says, this is passed in 1936. It was passed at the time of the rapid rise of grocery store chains, A&P and Kroger and so on. And what it says is, if you're a big consumer goods company or you're a huge retailer, you cannot use that power to give one buyer of a product, that is one supermarket chain or whatever, a better price for the same good, or like a lower price, I should say, for the same goods in the same quantity as you do a smaller independent store. It's literally just, it is a law that says you have to be fair to everybody. Everybody, if they're buying the same quantity of stuff, you got to sell it at the same price, full stop. If you don't do it, it's illegal. So that's what the Robinson-Patman Act says. It really, it was enforced, pretty vigorously for a really long time in this country, up until, as Attorney General Ellison mentioned, up until about 1980. And then they said, we're not going to enforce it anymore because we love these huge, giant, corporations that can bully people. So that's what the Robinson-Patman Act says. And it's the kind of thing that really speaks to the issue of dollar stores and the issues that Tammy is advocating for on behalf of her members. JD.
Yeah, I just really want to quick mention that, like, my vision, especially for like here in Iowa, is building that Dollar General coalition, because it is as much in rural as it is in inner city Des Moines. It is these places that should be having a healthy option for food that doesn't. And to me, like, that's just ripe for what we're trying to do here. So just wanted to add that.
Absolutely, JD. I appreciate that. And it's true. I spent a lot of time in, Toledo, Ohio. Toledo, Ohio is it's a city. It's a Rust Belt working class city, and they have to deal with the exact same issues of dollar stores and their predatory behavior in communities that any small town in the Midwest where I live has to deal with. So thank you very much for that. Okay, next question, and this is from Nicholas. Thank you, Nicholas. Is it possible for local advocates to sue based on antitrust laws at the state level? Or can only state AGs do this? Okay. I can answer that a little bit. It depends on state law. Some states have on the books what's called a private right of action under their own antitrust laws. That means the consumers and small businesses and others can sue using the antitrust laws. It doesn't only have to be the Attorney General. So that's about, I'm nobody's lawyer. Please don't. You need to consult with your local lawyer. But that's, anyone else want to weigh in on that?
As a paralegal, I have to always define I'm not an attorney, so I can't give legal advice.
Yes, absolutely. It is important to do. Okay, great. Okay, let's get to the next. I just have a bunch of questions. I'm like, so this is more of a comment, but I would welcome anyone to weigh in on this. And this is from Howard. Thank you, Howard. I live in Arizona, and I have a business here. Like many small businesses, we need to do business with Amazon, but unlike some, only about a third of our business is through Amazon. So Amazon obviously has a documented practice, I think, of really putting the third-party sellers that are forced, because of Amazon's monopoly power, they're forced to sell on Amazon. That's where the customers are. Okay, you got to be on Amazon. Amazon knows it has this power, and so it keeps third-party businesses really under their thumb. It charges them excessive fees. Sometimes 50% of any company's sale goes back to Amazon in fees and essentially what we call toll. It's essentially Amazon runs a toll booth for the online economy. Look, it's important, and I know that states are really taking on Amazon in different ways, both in terms of their economic monopoly power, the power they have over the workers in their warehouses. These are often company towns, that kind of thing. And for independent businesses, Amazon is this kind of constant presence out there that they end up having to to fight tooth and nail with to stay in business. I'll say that's kind of more of a comment, not really a question. But Ida, can you tell me a little bit about the kind of fights that you see in your work around Amazon, both in terms of small independent businesses and the workers in, in warehouses and so on.
Yeah, well, you gave a good overview, Ron, but I think a few pieces to note also. When it comes to corporate subsidies and incentives and tax giveaways, that's a whole other area that I think is linked to monopoly power when it comes to Amazon, just getting, again, another one up over local businesses because they've got just a whole crew of corporate lobbyists in state capitals. Of course, when it comes to like just environmental impacts, and you talked about worker power and the workers' right to organize. It's another big piece there. Also on just AI and surveillance in the workplace, of course, price discrimination. I mean, Amazon is, is a culprit of all of these things. And absolutely, it sort of denies small businesses a choice in the sense of like how to run their businesses. And so there has been federal action on antitrust when it comes to Amazon, but I also think in this moment, states really do have to lead. And I think what the legislators we work with are working to do is to empower attorney generals with the authority to do more of this antitrust work. And then also, of course, at that local level, there's things locally you can do. Like you can stop the creation of a warehouse and all these different things, right? We've seen across the country, local communities and states pursue secret deals to get Amazon centers there and basically pay them with public dollars that are not going to get return on investment on. And so, a big piece of that is banning secret deals at the local level and state level and exposing these different corporate giveaways. And then, with our legislator network, we talk about this a lot about just like the need to be brave. And Representative Schulten spoke to that about like doing the hard thing and making people uncomfortable. But we are up against like transnational corporations that do some really nefarious things around the world and have complete disregard for people. And these companies are also working to control our democracy through electioneering. And so these are hard fights, but to your point too, they're ones that start at the local level. But I also think one thing I'll say too is like being intentional to understanding how systems are working. So we should not blame a local business for having to work with Amazon, right? I think we have to also, as organizers, remember the structural disparities we have versus like the targeting the wrong target, right? So just always being strategic too around that and seeing the big picture.
Ron, could I add something?
Yes, Tammy, of course.
So I have a really unique story and perspective on this. Amazon warehouses were actually put into the same risk category as my distribution warehouses and my grocer warehouses. And of course, their safety was just not good. And so they caused the entire rate for all distribution warehouses to just go skyrocketing high. So I worked with our local Department of Labor and Industries and actually was able to prove that our distribution is not the same and that we have much different risk and peeled that off and separated them. So that was really critical for our grocers and for our distribution because that obviously impacts the cost of groceries. So just looking at it a little differently, I wanted to share that because that was huge for our stores and for our distribution.
That is fascinating, Tammy. Thank you for that. And you can see the way that monopoly power can spoil so many other things that are happening in the economy. I appreciate that. And thank you, Ida, for that as well. I mean, I agree completely. And we talk about all the time. It's not just, please don't blame the third-party seller for having to use Amazon. They have to. That's the nature of monopoly power. We also talk about how if you can't shop your way out of a monopoly problem. These are structural issues that are deep and that require policy. So thank you. We'll do. Let's do one more. One more question, and this is a good one. This gets back to something that I think we've been talking about this whole time. Can you share? And this is not directed to anyone, so everybody can weigh in if you want. But can you share where you see room for bipartisanship around corporate power? What do those opportunities look like realistically at the state level? I'll start with JD, and then Ida and Tammy, if you want to weigh in as well.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this a lot because there's a lot of stuff that I can't get past. But one thing that there's this made in the USA, like just bravado that we have. And I want a bill that finds companies that will have made in the USA, even so if they have it and it's actually not made in the USA, that goes after them pretty hard. I would think that's something that we can have some commonality on. But here in Iowa, with John Deere, laying off a bunch of union workers and then shipping the jobs down to Mexico in the past year, with no country of origin labeling from the federal level. I'm hoping that this is something that, when there is that sticker or that whatever, that label, it's important when it comes to that. So that's one of the things that I see, at least here in Iowa.
I think there's like countless examples. It's a great question. And as the representative said, it's not right versus left, it's bottom coming for the top, right? And so I think it's how we organize and how we build and how we talk about these issues. So there's countless opportunities when it comes to rural communities, grocery stores, cost of living, housing. I will note one piece too, I think is a unique area of organizing is around artists and like independent record stores and record labels. And I think there's a whole world there because arts and culture is a pretty bipartisan issue in a lot of states. And so I think there's also a window there to really organize folks. But I think it's always about organizing, the power you build in collaboration with those allied legislators, and then really taking that to the Capitol and making magic happen.
I will be very brief and just say, it's so important, especially where we are. We have to have bipartisan support or it's just not going to go anywhere. And I think when we can find commonality, and especially around grocery, everybody has to shop and everyone needs groceries. So we want to do the best that we can. And I think everyone would agree that, supporting local grocers is really important for the state. And so when we can find that commonality and we can really discuss, what are those points that we can agree to and keep things moving, that's really important.
Absolutely, it is important. I hope that's a real takeaway both from this panel and this entire event. Well, look, thank you all so much. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all take part in this conversation today. Thank you, really to our audience. We had a lot of people sign up for this, which is super exciting. Thank you for joining the event. We're very, very glad you tuned in. I hope, you take back whether you work in, you work in a state house, you work in an AG's office, you're an advocate, you're an organizer. We hope that this conversation really helps you do the crucial work of pushing back against concentrated corporate power in the states over the coming months and years. I think there's a real possibility for wins and to do good work together. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to each of the speakers today for their thoughtful contributions. I thought it was a super important conversation. Big thanks to State Innovation Exchange, incredible partners for working with us on this event and for co-hosting. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and I hope we get to do it again soon. One last thank you to the ILSR team who is running things behind the scenes, Katie Milani and Danny Kane, and our friend Geronimo Saldana from On Point, who produced this event and worked behind the scenes to make sure everything ran smoothly, which of course it did. Thank you so much, everybody. We look forward to seeing you again, working with many of you to see some real wins at the state level in the coming years. Thanks again.